Okay, I just wanted to make a quick video update for you. Just finished with the instrument, and boy, she was out of tune. So this piano, being an upright, is probably holding between 12 and 13 tons of pressure on it. Excuse me, I'm flying blind a little here with the camera. So the soundboard of every piano has a crown to it. On an upright, the crown is like a belly pushing out. On a grand, the crown is like a arched ceiling. And it's designed to be at a very specific curvature in order to ring like a speaker when the strings move. And when the piano hasn't been tuned in a long time, that down-bearing exertion of the wire is insufficient and the crown sits in an exaggerated pose. And then as I'm tuning, I'm increasing down-bearing over this dome, and it compresses and floats while I change the tension. That's happening on your piano, most certainly. It's going to need a second tuning in about 3 weeks, no sooner than 3 weeks. You can play it all you want during that time, but you're going to hear it settling. We may even wait a little longer than 3 weeks because some of the other issues I'm encountering, the touch response stuff, is a combination of atrophy from not being used and the wood being swollen. And when the wood contracts, when the heat turns on in earnest and the wood contracts, it will dry out. And that might free up enough of the touch response that we don't have to go after it. But we also might not, who knows what the heating season will be. There's very erratic weather. We did quite a lot of key easing, balance rail easing, one jack return spring, one hammer return spring, and most of that was effective, but this B up here that was resistant to return was the jack, which is, so the touch response mechanism of the piano is basically a miniature catapult. You're shooting the hammer at the string and catching and reloading it. You have to be out of the way or the string has no room to ring. We're going to come back to this dynamic in a second. So that moment of shooting the catapult so that we're out of the way of the string, that's called let off. And that function of shooting the catapult is achieved by the firing pin of our miniature catapult, which looks like a capital L shape. And you can imagine that the hammer is up here being pivoted toward the string, but at some point this needs to have room to bounce, so the L shape gets pivoted out of the way. This is the jack, and the pivot point would be on its flange or on its center pin. And just the wood swelling and the atrophy for this B, and most likely for all the friction we're seeing on up the piano, is that the center pin and the flange are just really swollen with moisture, so the jack refuses to turn freely. In order for me to free up just that B, the whole action had to come out. I'll attach a picture of the action on your floor. So pretty invasive. The key easing I could do without even taking the fall board off. So the piano was pretty cooperative up until the high end. And usually when we encounter a symptom on the piano, it's very rarely one thing. It's usually a bunch of contributing factors. So it sounds like a click, but it's really a rattle, a knock, and a rub. And in the low end, where the hammers are heavier, this symptom that we were encountering of friction or lack of return could be eased in some easier ways. Reducing friction on the keys meant that the other contributing factors within the action didn't have the symptom. In the high end, the hammers just don't weigh as much, so we can reduce as much friction as we want on the keys. The fact that there's not as much action weight at play means that binding is more observable and kind of we have to go after the multiple sources. But again, some of this might just clear up when the weather dries out, if the weather dries out. Got to put your piano back together. So we were going to talk about the dynamics of the piano. So this is me moving A440. And I'm doing it in slow motion so we can see let off. This is where our catapult, let me get a better shot from the side. This is where our catapult fires. And it's pretty far from the string. That's called early let-off. And what that means is for the musician, it's hard to play this piano softly because I'm trying to give it a little bit of force and it can't cross that great distance. What it means for the tuner is it's harder to stabilize this piano than it otherwise would be, because instead of being able to add force all the way to the wire, I stop adding force and stop adding force much too early. So a good analogy is I'm trying to karate chop something, but I stop putting in force halfway to the target. So more putting than punch arrives. So the instrument has early let-off throughout, and could be improved dynamically for the musicians to be able to play softer, and could be improved dynamically for me, the tuner, to be able to knock it into tune more securely. So you could see when I move the tuning pin, the first piece of the wire that moves is between here and this portion of the steel plate. This part stretches first and stretches most, and then we use the maximum force to the speaking length to draw out any latent motion onto the wire. An example I will give is of stretching a rubber band over my finger. If I'm stretching from here, there'll be a lot of stretched rubber band here, not a lot of stretched rubber band there. So we're using that maximum force to draw out all the change. So with the piano having early let-off, it's difficult to feel that we're as stable as we could otherwise be. Realistically, if the piano is for the little kids to play, they're not going to outgrow this dynamic in a while. If this is Joshua, if this is an instrument for you to play, then you might notice it, especially now that I've pointed out that it's hard to play soft. We don't want to make those changes right away. The piano really does need to square to the floor. We need to have full freedom of motion on all the parts before we can try to make it more responsive. And also the tone is pretty bright and brassy, so rubber caster cups or a carpet under the instrument to absorb some of the tone. We could also voice the piano, but that is open heart surgery, so we don't want to do that until we're really happy with all the other dynamics. So none of this is imperative. All of this is elective, but order of operations would make sense to wait. We'll see what the weather is in 3 weeks. Prime time for tuning gets toward Christmas. Grandma's coming. Everyone wants to sing Christmas carols. So we don't want to wait too long to book something because you'll end up in January. But we also kind of want to, we're gambling on the weather. We really do want dry, cold air to dry out this piano for us and see if it's going to free up all this binding in the jacks. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck taking the action out, taking weapons out one at a time, and manually trying to move those jacks around. Physical therapy to get the freedom of motion back. So that's going to be weather dependent. The tuning's just going to settle based on the downbearing change. And then let-off improvements could be done really anywhere down the road, but there is a logical order of operations for that adjustment as well, because I'm able to strike the string with more force and settle the latent motion on the wire. If I tune the piano today and change the let-off tomorrow, assuming the piano agrees with that change, that tuning will actually suffer from it because all of that extra force will pull out portions of the wire that weren't in the speaking length. The same thing happens on the guitar where you tune the tuning peg and there's a portion of the wire that has to go over the nut. And on the guitar you just strum it a little or pull the wire and you've equalized that tension. So the same thing's happening on the piano. I think that's all the information we need for today. So one trick when we get into dry weather, this piece here that's in front of your knees when you're playing, that's called the front door. For your piano, it sits in a tongue and groove. And let's see, where's the friction springs? There's a friction spring. I'll show you this with the door intact. But the old wives' trick for keeping moisture in the piano would be to put mason jars down here on the bottom board. Anything that can evaporate into the instrument. You'd have to fill that like once a week. There's not a whole lot of real estate in there to do this, but you could get certainly one nice big jar here that could evaporate. And then we've got a tiny bit of the instrument exposed to the heater. That's not ideal. But if we could put some cardboard just to protect the soundboard, that's your soundboard. The soundboard's very vulnerable. If we can protect this portion of the piano with some cardboard all the way down to the floor, that will make a big difference. It's not right up against the heater, so it's not the end of the world, but not ideal. And then obviously we're right next to the cold from going outside during the winter can also affect the piano. All right, let me know if you have questions or concerns. I got to put the instrument back together.